Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Today, I'm very glad to be joined once again by Dr. Jackson Nickerson, which we had a great conversation on a previous podcast on leading from the middle. Today's going to focus on decision-making and problem solving. So welcome again to the program, Jackson.
Thank you for having me back.
If you can let our listeners know, once again, your background and what got you interested in this topic. You have a great book on this topic as well.
Well, what got me interested is I started off my career as an engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So I'm a nerd from way back. I've been a professor at Washington University's Olin Business School for the past 25 years. And one thing that I figured out as we were teaching business strategy and organization theory is that ultimately, we don't do a good job teaching people how to formulate problems. We teach them how to solve problems, but all too often, they solve the wrong problem. And that's what really got me into this topic.
That's great. And we're going to unpack that a lot more during this episode. So I'll start out with, why do you think problem solving is not that easy?
It's the way our brains work. Our life experience, our education that we have, our families, we learn stuff. And that stuff goes into like little mailbox slots in our brain. And when we see a situation, our brain does this. Here, let me repeat. What it does is take the situation and quickly search through all those mailboxes to see if it found something similar. And sure enough, it does in a split second, and bam, out comes an answer. Have we really thought? No, I don't think so. What we've done is we've looked up in the mailbox as a solution. And we are so busy in our lives that that's the way we engage in problem solving most of the time. But if we're dealing with a new problem we haven't seen before, that old experience is not going to be very useful.
So true. And I find that a lot with my personal experiences, trying to rely on past experiences to solve problems coming up. And it's really not a good framework to use, especially if you don't have a good structure, or maybe the problem is so complex. It's messy. It's not defined well. So it doesn't fit into a package that's easily defined and therefore solved. So we have lots of impediments to thinking strategically, critically about these problems. Why do you think it is that teams solve a lot of times the wrong problem?
Well, for a few different reasons. First, what I want to do is talk a little bit about thinking traps.
Right.
So remember, I just did this thing that went. What that means is when we're exposed to these complex, I'm from Boston, so I call them wicked hard problems. When we're exposed to them, very quickly, we search through those little mailboxes and we jump to a solution. That is, we actually don't look at the complexity. We just try to find something that looks similar. And that's problematic. The second thing we do is we tend to zero in and look at only a small part of the problem. That's called a framing bias. And so we end up framing it rather narrowly. We can't see that wicked problem. An anchoring bias is one where we kind of focus in on the way it's phrased or one aspect of it. And that kind of moves the frame to a different spot. It's called an anchoring bias. We're still not solving that wicked problem. A confirmation bias says we think we're right. So as soon as we say it out loud, we're trying to find evidence to prove us right, not prove us wrong. I'm sure you've all experienced that. That's the confirmation bias. And then there are two other close cousins, you might even call them kissing cousins, which are self-serving bias and self-justification bias. Is often we view problems in terms of how they may benefit us as an opportunity, or how we can use the knowledge we do have, which again limits how we look at the problem. And self-justification is we tend to justify why we're looking at them those ways. So these 6 problems affect all individuals, and they certainly affect all teams.
Which one do you think is the most common in leaders today?
So there's some research that suggests even the top leaders, the top management teams in America jump to the wrong solution 70% of the time, 80% of the time, because we're so busy, we want to make a quick decision. And by doing so, we end up solving the wrong problem.
What are some strategies they can use to stop this bias from occurring so frequently?
Yeah, great question. The number one thing that you can do is to stop and try to formulate the problem 10 times, 10 different ways from different perspectives. You have your perspective and you can come up with a formulation. But the way to check yourself is to go to another person or adopt their perspective and reformulate it and say, hey, great formulation. I love it. Set it aside. Let's come up with another one. And when you force yourself to come up with 10 different formulations, what you're doing is looking at the situation from these different angles, different perspectives, and it forces you out of your box so you can see the situation more holistically. That's a process. It's a very simple process, and it doesn't take long to implement and execute, and it increases the likelihood of you breaking out of these thinking traps that I just mentioned moments ago.
I've used the De Bono's thinking hacks in this case as well, which offers that different perspective when you're looking at or wanting to look at problems from different perspectives as well, that I found that to be helpful.
Indeed, that was an earlier method for coming at it from different perspectives. I will mention, though, I think it's far more powerful to come at it from the perspective of a person, because then you can go and talk to those people. You can ask them what they think. You can use open-ended questions. And this is part of breaking open that box. And it's much more easy to do it, I think, by talking to people than to adopt different perspectives in your own mind.
I would agree. How about for the confirmation bias? That seems to be getting a lot of press as well. What are some strategies that leaders can use to minimize its effects?
This is especially true for teams, is what I try to do is I try to achieve unanimity in formulating the problem. That is, everyone has to agree affirmatively with a yes, that that is the problem. Because if they don't, it tells you that either they have different information, they have different knowledge, or maybe they have different motivation. And that actually matters as you're trying to figure out what the problem is. So having a rule of thumb that says, I'm going to try to achieve unanimity in formulating the problem obviates confirmation bias for a very simple reason. Confirmation bias comes from giving a solution, particularly early. If you reach unanimity in what the problem is, then all of a sudden, everyone has the same set of requirements, the same objective in evaluating different solution approaches. If they don't have the same formulation, then they're going to evaluate your idea based on how they see it. And that's going to cause you to push harder in terms of confirmation bias to confirm that you're saying the right thing. So you can avoid all that by making sure that you collectively reach unanimity on formulating the problem in its entirety before ever trying to talk about a solution.
I like that a lot. I'm going to start employing that myself. Like to talk about the framing effect. I see a lot of it with leaders in how they frame the problem limits the solutions that they're even looking at. And it really, it's a big impediment to them to not think outside of the box. They're thinking about these structured same solutions that they go through every single time because they're looking at it under the same frame. So what are some strategies that you could recommend to help break that bias or minimize its effects?
First, let's take a step back. You know, leaders get paid a lot of money. They have a lot of responsibility. They have a lot of obligations. They're the leader of a community. And they often feel that they're the ones who have to come up with an answer, a solution. They think their value comes from offering great solutions. And I think that's wrong. I think the value comes from engaging all the relevant stakeholders that may have different information. So I actually think the most strategic thing a leader can do is to learn how to facilitate conversations with others, as opposed to driving and pushing people toward a preferred solution. By doing so, you are opening the frame. You're able to see the situation on a much larger landscape. No matter how smart and bright an executive is, if they're not opening the landscape, they are in a framing box, their framing box. And therein lies the challenge. So I actually think it's changing their mindset of how they create value, which is to facilitate the stakeholders as opposed to giving the solution. I know that's not exactly what you're looking for, but I hope you'll find that useful.
Well, I do. And I talked to another leader, another thought leader, and he had stated the same thing. He said the higher up you go in any organization, it's less about having the right answers. It's more about asking the right questions and having those conversations as you move up. So I completely agree with you on that. Now let's go to teams and get back to now. We talked about the thinking traps, unpacked a few of them. You had mentioned a couple traps that are really common with teams and why teams find it so difficult to solve for the right problem. So if you could go through some of those traps and give our listeners some understanding about what they are.
Sure. We'll talk about two things. First of all, there's a fellow who won the Nobel Prize in economics. His name is Ken Arrow. I think he's like 97, and he's still alive. And he made this fascinating observation. He said, conflict in teams will go away if everyone has the same information, if they have the same knowledge, and if they have the same motivations. So the key to having a great team, first off, is trying to find a way to have those conversations so you're socialized around the goal and you share the relevant information and knowledge so everybody has the same stuff. That's one thing. The second thing I'll mention is there are some natural team dynamics that get in the way of formulating problems and coming up with good solutions. You might have a big dog in the room. The big dog often speaks first. When they speak first, no one else is going to say anything. They're not going to volunteer. You'll discover that people will throw solutions out quickly. And if someone doesn't like that solution or they want to compete, they throw out their own solution. So all of a sudden now you have this competition of solutions, often among two big dogs. Everyone else pushes away from the table. They lower their heads. They take out these funny little devices and they're operating them under the table. And then after the meeting, the big dogs walk down the hallways trying to build their political coalitions to win the day. These are all dynamics that occur in team meetings, which brings me back to facilitation. The key to overcoming a lot of these team biases is to learn how to facilitate. I'm going to give you one tip here that will change everything if you apply it. Here it is. Before the meeting, let people know you're going to call on them in a particular sequence, from the most junior to the most senior. Now, there are more things I can give you, but this one's really important. Here's why. If the junior people know they're going to be called on, they're going to work really hard to say something smart and useful. Once they say something, the next person of a little more status will want to say something smarter. And you keep going around the table, and when you get to those big dogs, the ones that go last, they want to synthesize everything into a big picture. Now, to do so, they just learn from everybody in front of them. Where if instead you allow them to go first, they're stuck in their frame, they get anchored, the confirmation bias kicks in, their self-serving bias kicks in, they self-justify. But if they go last, they're going to want to maintain their status, and to do so, they're going to have to appreciate what everyone else said and wrap it up in a much bigger understanding of what the real problem might be. So there's your one tip for the day.
Thank you, Jackson. Love that to counteract the information, knowledge, and motivation traps that most teams face. Great approach. Want to just talk briefly about one tip that an individual can use to enhance their critical and strategic thinking, and that's just having reflection time each day. If you could unpack that for our listeners and remind our listeners how important that is really to build these critical leadership skills.
Certainly. Well, I have a particular approach to reflection. First of all, everyone reflects, but often their reflection is not particularly effective. So I share with them a reflection that I developed called the apereo examen, which means an open, unfortified reflection. It's a Latin expression. In any event, what you want to do is first acknowledge what you've done well. Give yourself a little pat on the back. Try to come up with 3 things you've done well every single day. Why? Because what that does, it releases a number of chemicals in your brain. And those chemicals are like a happy pill that keep your brain on the positive side so we can reflect on what maybe didn't go so well. If you start with what didn't go so well, bam, your ego gets activated, you have threat responses, and you're less likely to learn from your experiences. So you want to start off with the positive, then think about maybe just one thing that didn't go well. Why one thing? Well, in my research, there's usually only one, two, or three things that keep repeating itself over and over. So all you have to do is focus on one a day. And I have a specific way to reflect, but the bottom line is try to figure out what you could have done better, taking full responsibility for what didn't go so well. Now, let me be clear. Mental health is a big issue and a growing issue. So if you have a day where you're under duress, you can't handle it anymore, then you don't want to say you're at fault. You want to assume that you're not at fault at all, and then evaluate to what extent that could be true. So there are some differences you might want to implement depending on your mental health status for the day. Nonetheless, if you do that, then you can take a step back and say, what's that heuristic? What's that little rule of thumb? What's that in that mailbox? If I come to that mailbox again, that tells me what to do. And so you want to construct a very simple heuristic in terms of what you would have done differently. And then you take that heuristic and you simulate it in your mind, different situations you might run into that would require that heuristic. And it's just like daydreaming. If you do that at the end of every day, you'll discover within a couple weeks, you'll start to behave differently. Now, if you want to learn about this and you send me an email, I'll send you an instruction sheet on what to do. And I'll even send you a web address where I have a web app where it takes you through a guide and set of questions. I'll do that, free for everybody who's interested in doing this reflection.
That's great. Thank you for offering that to our listeners. We'll make sure we put that in the show notes. And then I'm sure with those resources are stories and examples of different heuristics they could use in different situations to get them started out.
Indeed. We have them reflect after a month to see what's common. And I've done this with literally 1,000 folks. And what I've discovered is that for almost all of them, the vast, vast, vast majority of issues where they could have done things better boils down to one, two, or three key heuristics. And if you can create new heuristics in your brain that are stronger than the old heuristics, then you'll discover very quickly you'll behave differently, you'll think differently, and you will lead differently.
Well, are there certain heuristics that are common across the board, or are they unique to each individual?
Well, first of all, they're unique to each individual, but I've done a histogram for sure, and I'll tell you a few of them. It will come to no surprise that the number one issue that people have is they jump to a solution or they jump to a conclusion. That's the number one. The number four is that they're always late. And it turns out they're late because of a little heuristic they have in a mailbox. And once people recognize that and reprogram, they're never late again. It's really surprising. So there are at least, two that are up at the top, but there are others.
Great. Well, thank you again for joining me today on the program. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Sure. You can reach me at nickerson@wustl.edu. That's NICKERSON at WUSTL.edu.
Thank you, Jackson, for joining me today. You have a great book on this topic as well. You can find it on Amazon for a more detailed unpacking of this material and topic, or look for his upcoming programs with IMS. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.